What's up, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the MicroCast. I'm TJ David here with Zoe Rome.
Yeah, I'm Coach Zoe Rome. Excited to be here with co-coach and partner TJ David. We're going to do another edition of our partner race swap where we coach each other and give each other feedback on the races that we're undertaking using my experience at Western States and TJ's experience at the Leadville 100.
Right, yeah. You're doing Leadville and I'm doing Western.
Yeah. In addition to that, we're talking about how masters athletes can maximize their training as they age and what younger athletes can learn from the approaches that older athletes take to get the most out of their training.
Yeah.
I think it's a really important topic for athletes of any age, no matter what stage of your training you're in, because aging is inevitable and there's a lot we can learn from folks who are really taking the long view in their training.
Yeah, I agree. We're all aging, and so we've all got that to look forward to. We might as well get prepared now.
Exactly. Aging is inevitable. How you approach it defines what you will get out of it. But before we dive into that, we're going to do our hot or not, and this is going to be kind of a special edition. I think we're going to do a slightly deeper dive into this week's hot or not topic, spring energy gels. TJ, hot or not, spring energy gels, and are you up on the latest sort of controversy in the ultra running space concerning the caloric content of spring energy awesome sauce?
Wow. Okay, you're putting me on the spot here because
I'm just like, what background are you bringing to this conversation?
I am how do I put this? I used to use Spring Energy until I realized there were better products on the market.
When you say better, you mean it just like worked better, like a better fit for you? Or what do you mean?
Sure.
Okay.
A better fit for me, I think, is maybe a more politically correct thing to say. But I think maybe the hot or not take on this is I think there are better products out there than Spring.
Yeah, man, this is something I have a lot of feelings, opinions, and also a few facts sort of surrounding. So,
well, what's the controversy all about?
Yeah,
Because I'm not that up on it. I'm a little bit up on it.
So for ultra runners who spend a good bit of time on Reddit, there was a post that has really exploded in the past 10 days with over 200 comments. It's really blown up, and a lot of the ultra running meme pages have started to talk about it. But what it is that a scientist dehydrated and then used a bomb calorimeter to see I'm gonna need Kylie to correct me on this. Essentially wanted to actually find out how many calories and how much carbohydrate is in a spring energy gel. They were doing this in an attempt to actually recreate awesome sauce because it was someone who really liked the product but was kind of like, man, this stuff's pretty expensive. How do I try to make this myself?
Yeah.
So in their attempt to figure out how to make it themselves, when they dehydrated the product, they realized that there were fewer grams total in the package than even grams of carbohydrate
Wasn't
that Spring claimed.
50% less?
50% less.
That's significant if you
That's
are
correct.
using this as one of your primary fuel sources. I mean, if you use it at all in any
Yeah.
race, if you're getting half the amount of carbohydrates, that's
Right.
a problem.
And that's, that would be a big deal if Spring Energy had false nutritional information on their packaging. Just to be clear, Spring Energy hasn't responded in an official context to this, but it is notable they're deleting any and all comments off of their Instagram. I mean, I'm someone who's moderated social media in a professional context. It's a shitty job. I don't envy anyone that has to do that whenever your brand comes under fire. But I think this is a really important topic for athletes because if your fuel source has half as many calories and half as much carbohydrate as it's proposing, that is a big freaking deal. I'll also say that coming into this conversation, I really like the taste of Spring Energy.
Yeah.
I think it tastes really good. But I've for a while had a pretty big issue with how they market themselves. In fact, I actually wrote an op-ed for Outside about how Spring Energy sort of intentionally preys on athletes who might struggle with disordered eating and eating disorders because they have an entire campaign that they continue to invest in around quote unquote guilt-free fueling.
Is that because this stuff is more like whole food?
Correct.
I mean, it is processed. Let's be honest.
It's still
about
processed,
that.
yeah.
But
cooking is a process, packaging is a process,
Yeah.
cutting is technically a process.
but it is like, I consider it kind of like adult baby food.
Yeah.
Like it's kind of has that puree like texture.
Totally. Which, like, I mean, again, I enjoy the taste of in training. I have noticed when I'm racing, especially at a higher output, I can't stomach spring quite as easily as I can things like Goo Liquid Energy or Goo, normal, I guess, like more traditional gels. Hashtag no free ads. We are not sponsored or receive any compensation from any nutritional company. That's just my personal experience, so an N of one. However,
Yeah.
I was really put off by the guilt-free fueling messaging because it insinuates that other types of fueling should make athletes feel guilty. It insinuates that athletes who are just taking in the amount of carbohydrates that they need to compete should feel guilty for doing it because it's not as quote unquote clean or pure or unprocessed as a spring energy gel. And I think that type of advertising is hella problematic. It's kind of like if you walked into an AA meeting and there was a poster for like Smirnoff vodka and like the tagline just said, forget all your problems. You're marketing intentionally to a group of people who index at a high rate for having disordered eating and eating disorders, such as things like orthorexia or hyperfixation on the cleanliness, quality, and purity of products. And by intentionally sending the message that people should feel guilty for taking in processed carbohydrates, I think that's really fucked up.
Do you think that maybe? Do you feel like that's a pretty hot take? I think that you think Spring is intentionally targeting specific people.
They're targeting endurance athletes, which we know from research are at a much higher risk for eating disorders and disordered eating as compared to the general population.
Feels like maybe you're making an inference.
No, I'm saying that you're messaging in a way that is like really intentionally preying on insecurities to a population that you know and that we know from the research is at a higher risk for those exact insecurities.
You feel like they're self-aware enough to understand that that's what they're doing?
I don't care if they understand it or not. That is what they're doing. Like, it's a disordered message. Telling people to feel guilty for fueling because of where their fuel comes from is a disordered message that directly plays into the challenges that we struggle with in our community.
Yeah.
As someone in eating disorder recovery for 8+ years now, and as someone that works with a lot of athletes who struggle to undo that messaging, having a front row seat to the pain and the effort that it takes to undo the toxic messaging that diet culture sends to us every single day is something that I think nutrition companies must take responsibility in.
So you're saying that essentially there's no excuse for them to...
Do you think athletes should feel guilty for fueling?
No.
Then is it okay for Spring to say that their fuel is guilt-free, explicitly implying that other people's fueling should entail guilt and shame?
I mean, I think you're making an inference that they are having that kind of value judgment on people who are fueling with other things.
They are. I mean, if you're implying that your product is guilt-free, you're implying that other people's products are guilty.
You're suggesting that you know exactly what the people who are responsible for Spring's marketing are thinking. And
What
I
they're
don't think
trying to
that's
tell
necessarily
people
fair.
is that if you're not eating applesauce on your runs, then you should feel shitty about what you're eating because it's hyper-processed.
I mean, I agree.
What do you think they mean when they say guilt-free?
I think that they are trying to get people to use their products because they are, I guess, made up of... They're not made up of maltodextrin and fructose.
I mean, they are.
Well, not in the same way that, maybe a Morton gel is. Rather they're using like applesauce and like specifically the awesome sauce controversy here. It's like they're using applesauce, they're using, I don't know, quote unquote, like real food ingredients. And I mean, maybe they are kind of making a value judgment. I don't know. It feels just a little bit... I don't know. I'm not really like a hot take, gonna put the pressure on a brand kind of person. So it feels to me like a little like, wow, like that's pretty strong language. But at the same time,
I think implying that athletes fueling themselves should feel guilt or shame because of the perceived impurity or processed. Like, again, like if you're running enough to take in fuel, I do not think athletes need to be hyper fixated on what that fuel is necessarily. And we see so many athletes who really fall into the trap of being like, oh, well, I don't want to take in sugar, I don't want to take in too many calories when I run. And it's a problem that's endemic in our sport, and Spring is directly feeding into that to make money.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I think you're right on those things.
You know, I think that telling people that they should feel guilty about taking in food is a really problematic message to be trying to monetize.
Again, they're not saying people should feel guilty. They're implying it.
Right.
So
that's what I'm saying is the implication. Yeah, I find that implication problematic.
It is. You know, I don't disagree, and I think, you know, we've seen so many folks, you know, just as coaches putting our, you know, I don't really want to play the role of like safeguarding the community. I don't feel like that's my responsibility. These companies should be
but I
doing
think that it's okay to have a conversation around like, okay, what is the actual message of this advertising, right? And like what sort of impulses are they preying on in the endurance community, right?
Yeah.
Like this is a community that is like pretty focused on health and well-being, and then telling people that they need to feel guilt or shame just for feeding themselves while running, I think that's really a problem. And that's not because we're saying that you should eat a ton of processed food or that you don't need to think about what you're eating while you're running. But again, like we're seeing a company really explicitly plant their flag in the like, well, our stuff is made out of good food. It's made out of like pure food, and moralizing around where people get their in-run fuel from. I think that's a problem.
Yeah, it feels to me just an extrapolation of what other companies are doing in bigger parts of the health and wellness world.
Absolutely. I mean, they're not alone, right? Like, I'm not saying that they're the only company doing this. So many companies do it. And again, in a way that I think is pretty problematic, messaging around like guilt, shame, morality when it comes to food. I think a lot of that gets really tied up in, you know, a lot of different issues, but it just becomes really exacerbated in the endurance community because challenges of fueling are so prevalent. Like, I just can't tell you how many athletes I've seen struggle with like, well, I'm bonking on runs, but I don't want to eat candy while I'm out there. I don't want to take in so much sugar. And news alert, like carbohydrate is sugar, right?
Right.
So I think it's ill-informed, and I think it preys on a lot of people's lack of information about nutrition and an insecurity about their bodies and how they fuel them.
I think steering back to the main point, though, that you should know what is in the foods that you're eating. And if companies are not labeling their food correctly, it can be a pretty big performance issue for athletes.
Totally.
You know, taking the kind of the ethics and the morality just of their advertising out of the conversation for a second, because I think, you know, we can acknowledge what they're doing, and we've definitely talked about this is wrong, and I haven't seen them own up to any of that. We've all, you know, but at the same
and
time,
why
like,
would they? Because it's like it's still very in line with the cultural narrative of telling people to feel guilt and shame around food.
Well,
that
I
is
mean,
the American way: is shame and guilt around eating.
Sure, and I appreciate that perspective. I don't think that that's wrong, but when you own a company in a certain space, you have a certain amount of responsibility to the ethics, to be ethical, to be
sure,
to
but
have
also
morality.
like this is a notoriously under regulated marketplace as well, right? And so I think it really comes down to again, like why would a company that we've seen be like pretty vague and kind of shitty in their marketing language, like is that a company that you also trust to like follow through when someone asks them about correct nutritional information on packaging?
Well, I think at the end of the day, the only thing you really can do is like, you know, I'm a small business owner. I try to take into account things of a parallel nature in our marketing as an organization. I think a business has to take responsibility for that. I think especially in a niche market like the trail running and endurance space, it's just too small of a space. I mean, like the power, you see what happened when people got frustrated with UTMB
Right.
for their expansion and their marketing. It's the same, the same thing can play out here. Like, we can't tell Spring what to do. We can't tell them to, like, take ownership around their packaging. Like, this isn't,
I mean,
but
we
can exercise it by not buying their products.
Totally. Yeah. And I think another thing that's really telling is you see a lot more folks in the like trail space using Spring energy products compared to the marathon space, because in the marathon space, there's like slightly more, a lot of the marketing is a lot more geared towards performance and science. Whereas in trail, a lot of the marketing language is much more like experiential, and it's these like touchy-feelier sort of like all natural marketing approaches. And I think that that's something the trail space needs to be increasingly aware of, is that like marketers sort of like have our number, and they know that people are not as up on the science, and that they are maybe going to be a little bit more likely to buy something that's all natural versus something that's evidence-based.
Well, yeah, sure. And I think this is like people, who come over to trail running, a lot of them come over from other disciplines, and it's like, oh yeah, nuts and berries are great, like performance foods. And it's just like, so if we puree those up into something that's packageable, like that's a good thing to eat. And it's just like, oh, I wonder why I have GI issues on my runs. I wonder why, like, I feel bonky and tired. And they're, like for me, it's just like, oh, why don't you use Spring anymore? It's just like, simply, it's not a good performance product.
Right.
Sorry. Yeah. Like, it's just not good for performance. Like hydrogels, and there's way other better options out there.
Totally. And like, always, as coaches, our perspective is the best fuel is the fuel that works for you.
Yeah, I agree with that.
And that you need to trial and error this. But I do want people to pay a lot of attention to, like, why am I buying this thing? Is it actually because it makes me feel physically better, or is it meeting an emotional need? Like, could it be potentially tied up in some diet culture messaging that I've absorbed? Is it tied up in some eating disorder or disordered eating past or narratives that I'm looking to shed or disentangle myself from? And so I think this is just an important moment for folks to sort of like take stock of what their values are and what their goals are. And I mean, again, there was like almost no outcry years ago when they had all of this like quote unquote guilt-free fueling messaging, and they continue to really hammer that sort of messaging home. So like clearly it is resonating with folks in the community, but I just want to encourage folks to challenge diet culture messaging like that when they see it out in the wild.
What about Pop-Tart Minis?
Wow, what a pivot.
Yeah. Because this is the exact opposite of the Spring Gel.
I mean, is it? Like, these things are all, like, honestly not that dissimilar. Like, fuel is fuel. Pick the fuel that works for you. I guess I enjoyed that the Pop-Tart company doesn't spend a lot of money on advertising that's meant to make me feel bad about my body and food choices. Shout out to General Mills for not investing in that particular area. So I will say that you brought some Pop-Tart minis back from your last race. I found them in the pantry. I had a bag of them for breakfast plus some oatmeal before I went out and did a workout last week. I wasn't that into them. Ugh. They were like puffier, and like there was less flavor for sure.
They're as dry as a Fig Newton.
They were dry.
I am totally cold on these. I thought that these were going to be the secret to not crushing Pop-Tarts like in my vest during Western states.
Yeah.
Instead, I think that they're just going to be...
I think the surface area to fruit jam ratio is off.
I agree. It's just too much crust.
Too much crust, not enough jam.
It doesn't feel like a good pastry crust either.
Yeah, I actually have been meaning to specifically look and see how the nutritional information is different because of the, again, surface area to fruit jam ratio, to see if it would be better for performance. But even if it is better for performance, I think the flavor profile and the texture profile, frankly, is just not working for me.
I'm going to try Milano chocolate raspberry cookies on my long run this Saturday.
Well, you had 3 last night at dinner.
No, I had 6.
You had 6 last night at dinner. Incredible.
Yeah.
This is guilt-free fueling, people.
Right.
Take notes. Okay, why?
Cause they're like kind of buttery, like they just taste so good. Mm-hmm. I feel like, oh, this could be like maybe a refreshing change at hour 10.
Milano cookie.
Yeah.
I love
a little
this for
bit
you.
of fat in there. I don't know.
Yeah,
I'll have to check with my nutritionist.
Right. Well, because the longer you go in races, the more you might want to experiment with adding a little bit of fat and a little bit of protein later
Just
in the
a little,
stages
not
of an
too
ultra.
much.
Not a ton. We're not going to eat a spoonful of peanut butter out
I'm not
there.
going to be eating walnuts out there.
Jesus Christ. It's awful to think about. We once had an athlete who ate an avocado during an ultra, and it went poorly.
No, I've had olive oil.
That's a no-go.
Not me. I've had an athlete.
Right. No, I'm sure.
Oh, boy. Yeah,
That's
that
not...
was a lot of fat.
Wasn't there like another ultra, like didn't Killian or someone experiment with that one?
I
Or
think
like
it
Scott
was in
Jurek?
Scott Jurek's book, which
Okay.
is why one of my athletes experimented
Was
with
Scott
it.
Jurek just drinking...
They must not have read the part where Scott had really bad GI issues from that.
Feels predictable. I mean, back in the day when like Scott was like truly pioneering the sport, like we just didn't know that much about performance nutrition, but we have the science now, and the science says Pop-Tarts.
But maybe not Pop-Tart minis.
But not Pop-Tart minis.
Not on a hot day.
That's cold.
All right, what about hot or not? GI mapping.
I'm going to be hot on this. This is something so a GI map is like something that you would get via a PCR stool test where you take a poop test and then you get it cultured to sort of figure out what the components of your microbiome are. This is something that we've used with athletes to see if there's maybe an overgrowth or an undergrowth that could be causing an absorption issue or GI distress. Coach Kylie does a lot of these, and we've seen it be really, really. I'll be curious for you to share your personal experience, but I'll say as a coach, and I plan on doing one of these with Coach Kylie as well. Figuring out what might be causing persistent GI issues or under absorption has been really transformative for a lot of athletes. A lot of times things like runner's diarrhea or runner's trots becomes normalized in our culture. And excessive pooping while you run isn't normal and can sometimes be a signal of a much deeper issue that can just take a little work like a PCR stool test and GI mapping to figure out. So I would really urge athletes that maybe have had like a persistent iron absorption issue, vitamin D issue, bloating, or just like persistent gastrointestinal issues to work with Coach Kylie and maybe think about getting a GI map test done. What's your take? So I'm hot.
I'm hot. I'm hot on this as well.
What's been your personal experience with this?
It's it's expensive.
It is not cheap.
Definitely a financial
How much did you pay? Do you mind
I
sharing?
think it was like $350 for the test.
Yeah.
I felt like that was a really considered purchase.
Right.
But then I got on a protocol. I saw that there was a few issues that could have been. I think listeners might remember me talking about some of my vitamin D and iron absorption issues and how when I'm training heavily, I don't absorb those nutrients well. Mm-hmm. And when I am in low periods of low volume, I can absorb well. So there's some issue there. Could be the stress of training, but at the same time, the GI map suggested that there was some stuff that would be inhibiting absorption. So I've been doing a protocol through Kylie that already I feel like on my long runs, I feel a lot better on the runs. Like I don't get burps and stuff as much. Mm-hmm. Which is sometimes a sign that you're having trouble digesting what you're putting in. Mm-hmm. It's never really been a performance inhibitor for me, right. But at the same time, I don't know. I'm just excited, taking some digestive enzymes and things like that. I am excited to see if it helps me bring my vitamin D and my iron back up to higher levels, because when my vitamin D is low, that puts me at risk for bone injury, and I don't really.
And this was something that you've been supplementing iron and vitamin D.
Yeah.
And working with Kylie, you saw that there was a mismatch between how much you were taking in and what the results of your blood test were showing.
Yeah.
So again, that's how you pinpoint an absorption issue, and that can be pretty common in athletes, and that's one reason why it's important to sort of take a holistic perspective and to work with a healthcare practitioner similar to Kylie, or Kylie specifically, who can help you develop a strategy to, again, pinpoint pinpoint not just the symptoms, but the underlying causes of any nutritional and energetic issues.
It's crazy how much these these things have helped athletes that I've worked with.
Yeah.
And so it's like so great to finally be doing it myself.
Yeah. Nice.
Rolling hills, hot or not?
You know, I feel like I feel neutral about it's a thing that exists on Earth and you run on it. Is it my favorite terrain? Maybe not. I feel fine.
You feel fine about it?
I feel fine about rolling hills. Like, they're definitely hard, right? Because, I feel like especially in Colorado, a lot of our terrain is like straight up, straight down, straight up, straight down. Rolling hills can be a unique challenge because it's sort of the death by 1,000 cuts that you talked about at Lake Sonoma of it can be hard to get momentum going. It can be hard to develop a nutritional strategy around it.
Yeah.
So I definitely would say rolling hills are tough, but that maybe having an emotional reaction to them, such as, declaring they're hot or not, might not be very helpful.
I'm surprised you don't have a take on this.
I don't have a take on
Wow,
this.
you have a take on everything.
But this is just a thing out in the world that exists,
I'm hot on it.
You like rolling hills. You're
I
want more rolling hills in my life, please.
Yeah.
As compared to what other types of terrain?
Flat or straight up and straight down.
Okay.
Because I think the inconsistency of it, it's not very predictable.
Right.
I feel like that's challenging mentally and physically, and it really forces you to work on good running economy. Forces you to continue to work on strength training so you have power throughout the entire duration of a run. I like it because for me personally as an athlete, I find it challenging. So I can get to my growth edge pretty quickly on that terrain.
Yeah.
Rather if it's straight up, after about 20 minutes of going up, I'm I'm just going to go up for another hour and that's fine. And you feel, you just get used to it. It's going to happen. But with rolling terrain, it's just you're up, you're down, you're up, you're down. You don't, how long is this hill going to be? Oh, it's not that long. Great. This downhill's really short. There's no flow. And I'm a real rhythm runner.
Right.
So I get used to being in that certain kind of at that certain place and that certain level of RPE. And with rolling hills, you're just all over the map.
Yeah. Can't believe you have a stronger reaction to mixed terrain than you do to diet culture.
I mean, gosh, I don't try to get involved in
I just feel like
that.
being a woman who was raised in America, you don't have a choice about getting involved in diet culture. It'll come find you, you know? From the time you're born, you're told the way that you're eating and looking and doing and being is wrong. And if you eat and look and do and be this way, then you're good enough. And then anyone that doesn't fall short, and inevitably we all fall short and end up giving all our money to men in C-suites who don't care about us at all.
To be frank with the audience, with you, you know this about me. I have a background, a certification in holistic health coaching, and that primarily relies on and leans on eating whole foods, not eating processed foods, not
but when
eating
you're
puree.
running,
doesn't matter. So
it does matter.
It doesn't
because your performance your ability to then why don't you just eat apples when you run?
A lot of people with a background that I have would do exactly that. So that's why I'm saying
and they will shit their brains out.
And they'll wonder why that's happening. And because they're so attached to that specific diet, they won't, it will take them maybe time to figure out oh, maybe this doesn't actually serve my performance needs. It's
I guess
just
then
I'm not
I would
attached
say,
to any one thing.
As someone with a background in science communication and in eating disorder recovery, I find that hella problematic. And there are a lot of people who suffer from a hypervigilance around processed food to their detriment. I know that that's not maybe looking at the general population. Yes, a lot of people could definitely focus on integrating more whole foods into their diet. But when you look at the population that we're speaking to and that we work with, more people than not suffer from not eating enough and from being hypervigilant about the purity of foods. And so that's why I want to offer a corrective to that messaging and invite everyone to just be a bit more curious than beating themselves over the head with the same worn out messaging that tells us that we should feel guilt and shame around food.
I think that given the proper amount of support from coaches like yourself, therapists, dietitians, most athletes.
Do you think athletes should be worried about how processed their food is when they're training and racing?
No, absolutely not.
Great. That's all I wanted to hear then.
I just think that, I don't need to have a take on that. Like, that's over responsibility for me. I'm like, I
No,
want
it's
to
not,
set
because
you up
we
with
are,
tools.
like, these are people that we care about and that we coach who suffer from hearing this messaging and having it crammed in their faces. Like, I can't tell you how many deep dives I've been on with athletes where, like, we're trying to overcome their fear around eating processed
Yeah, but you're
foods.
conflating the messaging with the actual product, and you're focused on the messaging, which
Well,
I hear is definitely flawed and wrong, and I'm focused more on what is actually in the gel, which maybe works for certain people, but definitely isn't probably the best performance related food out there. And the reason why you're conflating the two is because
they're responsible for that messaging.
they are, well, yeah, but there's also kind of that, like, that middle line where we think that some folks, like, maybe you have a eating disorder past, or perhaps like you're like me, like where you got started like with one-on-one coaching through like a different lens, like holistic, whole foods, integrative nutrition. You like look at those products and you're like, oh, that's the closest thing that I can find that's in alignment with kind of like my personal philosophy around how you should eat. And I think like the point is, it's just like, and I think that this is the point you're trying to make, is just like performance at the end of the day doesn't really differentiate between those foods. It's just like you must be eating enough, you must be eating the right things
Right.
in order to facilitate performance and recovery. And so then for me, I'm like, I don't need to have a hot take on this, because like I just want to make sure people are getting what works for them, and that's what's going to help them get to where they want to go.
Right, but we know that you will not be getting what works for you if you feel guilt or shame around eating while running.
Totally, but that's, again, I think, that's why you have a coach, a therapist, a dietitian, so you can work on,
And
if you have
a media critic who's willing to hold brands accountable to their flawed messaging.
Yeah, and I love that. And I mean, like, totally that.
And that's not a hot take. That's just like, hey, you're doing a shitty thing. Stop being shitty. My take is that you shouldn't try to make money off of people's eating disorders.
I don't know. That just feels so like,
To me, again, as someone in recovery, it feels really clear. And I think
Yeah.
that to a lot of other folks who might identify with my experience, it'll feel pretty clear. And it's fine for folks who don't identify with it. Like, have fun eating whatever the fuck you want and feeling great about yourself. That sounds really nice, but I don't identify with that experience.
no, I mean, that's, my privilege, and also, my implicit bias from, my background, my history. It's going to be different than yours or other people that you or I might work with. But at the same time, I mean, if that's true, if they're like really positioning themselves in their marketing in that way, they are fully conscious and aware that they're doing that, that's totally fucked up. And as consumers,
Even if they're not, though, like, that's the consequences of that messaging we see and we deal with every single day with our athletes.
then, as consumers, we should hold the power and not purchase those products.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, if they're not going to take ownership of whether they knew it or not, if they're not going to take ownership, like, they should take ownership. If they're not going to do it, then forget about it, Like, it's going to be the last product I recommend for athletes.
Yeah.
And now it can be for two or, multiple different reasons.
Again, I think, like, use the product that works for you, but I think that it's really worth continuing to have serious conversations around messaging that implies that athletes should feel shame.
I agree. Totally. And we shouldn't be shaming people around.
And also, release the nutrition info. We do want to know. Like that, we got to know.
I wonder
So
if
I look forward to continuing to follow this saga, and we'll update.
I wonder if they just like misprinted their labels and were like, we can't afford to like reprint all these, so fuck it.
I mean, no fucking way. As a small business, like you can't legally do that. No one can do that, regardless of the size of business. Publishing false nutritional information is not legal.
How could they screw that up so badly?
Again, I can't wait to find out. I hope that there are answers. And maybe, maybe what came out of the bomb color or whatever, the dehydration test, maybe that information's not accurate. But I do hope that it leads to a continued discussion in the endurance space about better evidence-based fueling practices and sufficiently regulating food and supplements.
Do you think this will lead to more mistrust around what people are consuming and maybe like a paranoia almost around like the products we use?
I think that this particular company for a long time has benefited from a veneer of like really positive brand association because of being all natural and hippy dippy and peace and love in the trail space. They have a lot of athletes. But like anyone can pay for athletes, you know? And
I don't think they pay.
Well, famously, actually, yeah, their ambassador program is known as being one of the more exploitative. I'm sure that they do pay or like compensate their pro team in some way. But I hope that it again empowers all athletes to approach their nutrition and fueling practices with a critical eye.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like, I don't know, something that always was helpful for me and helped me kind of like break out of that like lens on, you know, always eating whole foods, being very strict vegan, was just the idea of like what feels fun to eat after a really hard effort. And like when I switched my framing, when I kind of restructured my thoughts a little bit around that, it was amazing like how much faster my appetite came back after like harder sessions.
Right.
Like sometimes it's just like, reaching for like the healthiest thing and then like having to like we deal with those labels of like this is healthier than that. It's just like, that doesn't
totally
feel
a lot
like
of times
good.
Right, like the healthy is more of a moral or like a value judgment rather than really taking a holistic perspective, which I think that a lot of times the word holistic gets co-opted by bad actors in the space to make people hyper fixate on the health and purity of their food rather than like, man, I just did a long run today, so the healthiest thing might truly be for me to ball out with some pizza.
Right.
You know, a very processed food that we all love and is a great performance aid. And again, like health can also take into account mental health. If being healthy keeps you from like being around other people and eating around people, that's not healthy. If you need to go home and eat your salad and smoothie instead of being with, you know, folks from your running team, that's not healthy. If you're not able to fuel yourself regularly in a way that makes sense for your finances, that's not healthy either. Health is a really big term, and I think that we all need to zoom out and look at the health of our diet from a much broader perspective.
Thoughts, behaviors,
actions.
Yeah.
So health is a big word, and I think that we all need to define that for ourselves rather than ceding that definition to folks who want to make money off of us.
Yeah, don't give them the power.
Don't give them the power.
I like that. Be clear about, you know, what that means to you.
Yes.
And what outcomes that's going to help you produce.
Right. And if it's not mentally healthy, then it's not physically healthy.
Let's get into our partner race swap.
Yeah, now that we're 37 minutes into the podcast. Yeah, so TJ, you ran the Lake Sonoma 50 last week. How are you feeling?
It took
Itchy.
me, I feel really, I got a lot of poison oak out there.
Yeah.
It's, sleep has been not great because of that. Yeah, it's been pretty uncomfortable. Man, California, beautiful, but all it takes is a rainy day and, I don't know, touching one 3-leafed vine and you're screwed.
I know our friend Kat Bradley, the year that she won Western States, actually, she accidentally used poison oak as toilet paper.
Oh, no.
And poison oak doesn't usually get bad until a few days after, which is tough.
I hope
it's
that's
real tough.
Not an overshare.
Nah, she's talked about it on her podcast.
Okay, all right.
She willingly shares that story.
Oh God, that's
she's a good
awful.
sport.
Thank God that was not my experience.
Yeah. So besides applying a ton of calamine lotion, what have you done this week to really maximize recovery and transition from, you know, doing this 50-mile race to get ready for Western States into thinking about the build-up specifically for states?
I would say the one thing that I've really been thinking about is leaning into abundance, not needing to prove, because I actually rested a lot this week. I took
How much time do you usually take off after a 50-mile race?
I usually feel like I take 4 to 5 days off, but actually I was prescribed 6 days off. And I wanted to really start running again after 2. And I felt myself get into that kind of like place of scarcity where it's like, I should train.
Right.
I should train. I feel good. I should train. I feel good. I should train. And that, at least for me and a lot of folks that I've coached, people who train on days when they're supposed to do less or rest, that comes from not feeling like what you have, the body of work you've done is enough.
Right.
And so I really recognize some of that coming up for myself. And I just I use it as an opportunity to be like, no, you have done enough. Like, these training days are going to support, like, these rest days, training rest days. See, I already reframed it. I already thought they were training.
They're adaptation days.
Yeah, it's training, man. Rest is training. And like that, for me, I was like, boom, setting myself up for the weeks to come.
Yeah, so when I raced Western States, I also did a 50 miler in the build-up. And because I was part of this Inside Tracker sort of like elite athlete study, I did a blood test 4 or 5 days after my 50 miler and looking at how much CK, so like sort of creatine kinase, which is a proxy for muscle breakdown, seeing how much muscle breakdown I was still showing in a blood test 5 days after the race was pretty mind-blowing to me. And seeing that like my liver enzyme levels were still really, really elevated. Essentially, like, look, even though I felt great and was totally like mentally and felt physically superficially like I was ready to get back to training 5 days after the 50 miler, and then seeing what my blood test showed, I was like, man, I'm glad my coach has me resting for 6 days after this, because my blood test looks like someone that had been hit by a truck. It was a really hot race. It was a really fast race. So I just had a lot of muscular breakdown, a lot of kidney and liver, not like issues, but sort of like caution signs that taking a few extra days to really rest, recover, refuel, rehydrate, and make sure my glycogen stores were topped back off. I was really glad for that. And I think that goes to show that even though mentally and physically you can superficially feel ready, a lot of times, like the deeper cellular level of what we're going through, a lot of those signs might point to, oh, we could benefit from a little extra rest.
Totally. And again, like, the damage is done down to a cellular level. So if you feel good, just go out and run for a while and you'll realize, like, oh, maybe I'm not actually super recovered.
Totally. And then being and feeling ready, and then being able to benefit from additional time to adapt to the stress stimulus that is an ultra marathon is another thing. Sure, you could maybe run and it would be neutral, but it might even be more beneficial to rest so that you can really adapt to the stimulus you were given.
Yeah. So I'm excited to be well rested going into the next couple weeks of training.
Yeah.
Which are looking pretty fun and big. And we got some trails open now. So
yeah.
Perfect.
Oh my gosh. I've been loving that, which I think sort of is a caveat or a transition into what I'm doing right now. So I'm training for the Leadville 100, which isn't till August, but I'm already working on building some serious volume. So I've been sort of focused on having really high quality long runs. I'm starting to do all of my long runs on trail and making sure that I am flexing that fueling muscle, and making sure that I fuel every 20 minutes when I'm doing my long run.
Nice. Are you changing up any of your fueling habits based on the last couple years, or based on the fact that this race is going to be up high?
Yeah, so I'm not really able to experiment with high altitude fueling just yet. I did actually do a few miles around 9,000 feet yesterday above Carbondale, and I definitely was feeling the altitude. And I made sure that even when my stomach was like a little bit feeling the thinner air yesterday, that I continued to take in fuel, even though physically it was a bit more challenging. So nice. I'm sort of doing what has always worked for me, but also incorporating some fun fuels like candies. I've been really enjoying Twizzlers on my long runs lately, and some trolley gummy worms. So that I can sort of like, again, just continue to take in more carbohydrate while I run.
Great.
And I've also, I did a sweat test last year, which revealed that I needed to take in significantly more electrolytes than I historically had been. So I'm just making sure that I really continue to dial in my hydration and electrolyte game on the long run.
Are you practicing getting 100% of those needs, 80%, 75%? What does that look like?
Yeah. Well, I mean, do you want me to tell you specifically what I'm drinking?
Yeah, I'd love to know.
So it just depends on the day. Sometimes I sort of mix up my specific electrolyte mix, and I'll take an electrolyte capsule But I have been alternating between using Scratch and Element on my runs.
Nice. Cool.
Yeah.
Sweet.
And I think, another thing that I've been doing is for my workouts, I recently bought a hydration belt. I usually have not, I really hate having a handheld when I run. It just really annoys me. So I've been using like, carbohydrate rich electrolyte drink for my workouts so that I can make sure I get a steady input of fuel even when I do a workout. So a lot of my workouts are starting to get longer than 90 minutes, building some volume here. So I'm making sure that I fuel my workouts at a, even though I could theoretically quote unquote get away with only taking in about 100 calories for a 90-minute run. I'm fueling them a little more aggressively and intentionally to maximize my output.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. I was just talking about that with one of my elite athletes about a week ago or so. When those workouts start to get into that 90-minute range, I mean, there's really no harm in fueling those workouts. And also, that's going to practice digesting.
Right.
Under stress.
Correct.
Under fatigue when it's going to be harder to. So kind of getting some of that like GI training in before the race, kind of like maybe simulating a little bit what it would be like many hours into an event when you're starting to fatigue, blood is moving away from the GI system, all of that.
Right. Yeah. Well, the main thing that we wanted to talk about today is adjusting training for masters athletes. So a masters athlete is anyone who's older the age of 40. And I think this is a really important conversation to have, like we said at the start of the podcast, because we're all going to age, right? Like this is the one part of life that is really inevitable. So, and there's a lot of things that even younger athletes, like I'm only 30, you're 37, so you'll be a masters athlete before long. But there's stuff that we can all learn from the approach that masters athletes take as they age. So the average age of elite track and field athletes and marathoners is about 30, but you'll notice that endurance athletes like ultramarathoners tend to peak much later in life. For instance, Katie Arnold won the Leadville 100 when she was 48. And the age of peak performance increases as the distance increases. So you see a lot of masters athletes having a lot of success at ultramarathons. I remember when I ran Western States, the majority of women who went top 10 were older than 35, and the majority were parents. And I found that really inspirational, that particularly women can have amazing breakthrough performances even when they're not, 24 anymore.
Yeah, no, it's one of the cool things about these like ultra long events.
Yeah. So
aerobic capacity, you can keep building.
Exactly, right. So even as your VO2 max might not be increasing and your sort of high end output might not be, on the same growth trajectory as it was when you're 30, there's still a lot you can do to maximize performance. And I think it's really important that people continue to run as they age. We see in the evidence that regular exercise puts folks at a decreased risk for clinical depression and anxiety, as well as cardiovascular and metabolic disease, no matter what age you are. So I think continuing to stay engaged in whatever activity fulfills you is a really important way to make sure that you are healthy as you get older.
Yeah, totally.
Other studies show that exercise, particularly running, helps athletes maintain bone density and delay muscle aging as they get older. And one study that compared masters-aged marathoners to their sedentary peers showed that active athletes had substantially greater physical capacity, better long-term health outcomes, better motivation and psychosocial perspective, and they better fought dogma and negative stereotypes around aging. So there are a lot of benefits from continuing to exercise as you get older.
I love that it's not just physiological benefits, but clearly there are some pretty amazing mental benefits to it too.
Totally. So TJ, how does aging affect athletes physiologically?
Well, I think there's the obvious, the decrease in VO2 max, about 10% per decade after 30. Good to know that that's for athletes who are not training. So if you're training, that decrease is going to be less.
Correct.
And if you're doing the right kind of training, that, you can really kind of like delay that process. But that is still going to happen, even if you are traiing. So remember,
but
that's
just
part of the
it
process.
slows that degeneration down significantly.
Same thing, though, with your lactate threshold. That's going to decrease as well, but good training can help to maintain that. Yeah, what else? It becomes more difficult as you age to hydrate and to synthesize protein.
That's right. Actually, yeah, and we'll talk a little bit more specifically about muscle mass because that's one of the primary things that we see affect aging athletes. But I saw really one really fast. I mean, a lot of these studies are so fascinating, but I like this study specifically of octogenarians, so people in their 80s. So lifelong endurance athlete octogenarians had double the VO2 max output of their untrained peers. So if you're able to still stay engaged and active throughout the course of your life, your VO2 max can be double that of the folks who are just hanging out at the nursing home.
Imagine that. That'd be pretty amazing.
And there's another study of running economy. That's something we talk about a lot here at Microcosm. So this study compared 28-year-old and 60-year-old triathletes, so not runners specifically, but endurance athletes nonetheless. And researchers found that the average energy cost of running was about 11% higher in masters athletes. So your running economy, we can counteract this a little bit through training, but like the energetic cost of running does go up as you age. Interestingly, this was primarily tied to muscle power due to the decrease in muscle mass via both muscle size and number of muscle fibers, and not due to the plasticity of muscle fibers themselves. So that again shows the importance of doing everything you can to maintain that muscle mass as you age.
Intuitively, we know that makes sense because you do lose muscle mass as you age, so strength training becomes more important. And then, really, I think the big takeaway there is trying to maintain that muscle mass because that keeps your power higher.
Right.
When your power is higher, your economy is generally better.
Totally. So again, we talked about as you age, your ability to synthesize protein declines. Being able to maintain muscle mass is really important. And taking in protein helps muscle repair and rebuilding. And so some training approaches that we adopt for masters athletes is trying to spread out higher intensity interval training. So when you're younger, you can tolerate higher intensity sessions back to back, but your ability to synthesize protein diminishes as you age. So spreading that out so that you can maximize recovery becomes really important, even though we still want to do some amount of higher intensity as we age.
Yeah. I mean, I think the general rule, if you can make one for most folks, is to avoid back-to-back hard days, to have at least 24 hours before. And so, as athletes age, going up to 48 hours, maybe even 3 days between maybe a workout and a long run, or a workout and another workout day, a day where you do hill strides and another day you do hill strides, is giving yourself that space to actually repair.
Yeah, and another thing that we really emphasize with masters athletes is avoiding taking long breaks from training to help prevent injury. Because as you age, you also see a progressive decrease in tendon and muscle elasticity. So how stretchy and springy your muscles and tendons are, and you become additionally prone to soft tissue injury like tendinosis and different ligament issues. And the number and size of your muscle fibers decreases as you age. We also see an increase in joint stiffness, and because of that, biomechanical changes. So we do want to still continue to do things like hill strides and fast strides to make sure that we're doing as much as we can to optimize our biomechanics to combat any sort of joint stiffness related biomechanical changes.
Yeah. Man, the warm-up is something
that
I think
really,
is
really
super
important.
key.
Yeah.
The dynamic warm-up, making sure, even for some of my older athletes, I'll have them just walk for 5 or 10 minutes as well to kind of get things going. That really help. I've seen that with my athletes that really helps with like the stiffness that aging athletes feel when they're first kind of like starting out on that run, or if they're coming back after a day, like where they did a bigger run, maybe they did a long run and they're going to run the next day. It's like really making sure you do some dynamic warm-ups that you're like getting the engine going before you actually start your session.
Right. And because protein synthesis and muscle mass declines as we age, another thing that we really work on with our masters athletes here at Microcosm is putting a little more emphasis on strength training and cross training. Mm-hmm. So what kind of cross training do you work on with your masters athletes?
Well, it depends on the person, but primarily...
Right. Obviously, this is all very individual, but how do you structure in more cross-training for masters athletes?
I guess if I was to like, I don't know, pick, it's kind of hard because again, it's individual, but there are a few different modalities. I think there's elliptical is great. The bike is great. Like these are low impact.
Right.
So low impact
That's what I was getting
activity
at. Yeah.
is super, super important. And then depending on, the athlete, their ability level, it could be every other day cross training where they're running maybe just 3 or 4 days a week. Or, maybe if they're a little bit more of an advanced runner, but they are older, they might still be running 5 days a week, but some of those sessions are shorter, so they'll do a little more time on the bike or the elliptical to supplement some of that lower volume running training. It totally depends on the person. There's so many different ways that you can implement into the training. And so if you're an older athlete, I mean, this is really one of the reasons why you have to work with a coach.
Right.
It really helps to take the pressure off of having to make those decisions when you have somebody else in your corner who can help you interpret the signs and signals your body's giving you to help you understand, like, okay, this is a day I should be running. Or this is a day I should run, but much shorter than I would have 10 years ago. And instead, I will make up some of that volume by being on the bike.
Totally.
So, I mean, there's so many different ways to do it. I think, like, man, for some of my older athletes, like, I love them doing bike workouts.
Yeah.
Rather than, like, really intense running workouts. So they can still push some of the same aerobic systems that I'd be working on with a younger athlete, but they're doing it in a context that's lower impact,
totally
less risk for injury.
Yeah, another thing we really work with masters athletes on is developing a strength routine that supports their running. Obviously, we always encourage working with a strength-specific coach who can help identify any imbalances, weaknesses, or sort of biomechanical inefficiencies that you have. But to combat that reduction in muscle mass that leads to that like higher like energy need, we again, lifting heavy and lifting a little more consistently than you might have been able to get away with when you were younger becomes really, really key. Again, I always urge people work with a specific strength coach, but I would argue for adding between 1 and 2 extra sessions, like adding an additional session as you age, being really, really helpful. But again, making sure that strength is intentional to support the running.
I completely agree. I think something that a lot of folks tend to overlook is also like the changing psychology of masters athletes.
Yeah.
Excuse me, the changing psychology of masters athletes, because like the why, motivation, goals, the overall experience, what athletes are trying to get out of their training as they get older really does change. It really is a lot different when you're younger, when, PRs are always like a training block away for a lot of like athletes who run consistently and put the time in. And at a certain point, it's just like you've run the fastest marathon you can ever run. You've run the fastest 100-miler you're ever going to run. So those goals have to change, the motivations, the why. Another great reason why you should work with the coach, because you can have like these open and honest exploratory kind of conversations and develop a dialogue around it, so you can really begin to understand, what's making me tick, but, this at this stage of my life, rather than when I was younger, when I was in my 30s or 40s.
Totally. And that's another reason we really emphasize process orientation here at Microcosm, because at a certain point in your life, if your motivation is always just like doing the best you've ever done, getting the PR, that outcome is no longer going to be relevant for you. That just becomes a physical impossibility, and that's okay. Like, fighting that is not helpful, but embracing it, being honest about it, and whatever feelings come up around it is so, so important. And there's still a reason to stay engaged with the process, even if, if your PRing days are behind you. So actually, one study that I looked at showed that the primary detriment to the psychology of masters athletes is actually the ageist attitudes of others. And this really can affect masters athletes' self-perception, and they absorb ageist attitudes from around the endurance community, and they start to internalize like, well, I'm not getting faster, and that in turn leads them to stop getting faster too.
So what can we do to support some of those athletes?
Accept aging. Celebrate it when you can, when you feel good about it, but also talk about it when you don't feel that good about it. And the thing is that it's going to happen to everyone. There is nothing you can do to escape aging other than dying, which is not a preferable outcome. And it's not a negative thing. Aging is beautiful, right? Like the whole value in the sport community can't just be around faster and faster all the time. Accept the peaks, embrace the valleys.
I would go as far as to say that any athlete listening to this should be about the experience before those outcomes.
And again, that's why I think it's so important for people who, again, maybe aren't a master's athlete yet to listen to this and to think about this, because it will be a part of your journey. And there are things that you can learn from it, even if it's not yet a part of your journey.
Yep.
Aging is going to bring up uncomfortable feelings. It's important for us to remember that it's not about laying down and giving up. But accepting aging head on and opening up to the uncomfortable thought and feeling and experience that comes up as we go towards it, right? I think like there are a ton of pretty toxic cultural narratives around aging, but we can play an important part in undoing that and in celebrating age group athletes and in talking about how your training should adapt and change as you age, rather than fighting it and saying that the only thing we're striving for is always being faster and faster and faster, or going longer and longer and longer. There's something really beautiful to deciding what goal matters to you and to approaching it in the way that makes sense for your current life stage.
Yeah, I agree. I think something that really we find helpful in our community is highlighting age group results. And then also, something that we can all do, going back to, as consumers, we can help to influence change via where we spend our money. Spending money on events that have inclusive cutoffs, I think, is really helpful.
And I mean, we're lucky enough that we have some event directors in the Microcosm community. I know there's some that listen to the podcast as well. And actually, I think that, specifically some of the event directors on our team are pretty, are really leading the charge in this space. So amazing job to those folks. But I also think having no drop group runs and really just making sure that we, have accommodating cutoff times and that we message clearly around those times. But overall, the message is that age is good. Embrace it, accept it. It's also okay if it makes uncomfortable or negative feelings come up. Talk about those with your coach. And if you don't yet have a coach, hire one, because it becomes increasingly important to be strategic and intentional about your training as you age. You can continue to get faster, but you're not going to do it alone.
Yeah. Well, awesome. Great conversation. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Please reach out. It's been fun to get questions, comments from you guys. Pop-Tart Minis, we hit that today because of some comments from the team. You can reach us at microcosmcoaching@gmail.com or microcosm-coaching.com. Have a good one.